Today, our speaker is Michael Schuler, who served as the senior minister of the First Unitarian Society in Madison for over 30 years and retired in June of this year. He holds a master's degree in divinity and a doctorate degree in the humanities. Reverend Dr. Schuler is the author of the book, Making the Good Life Last, 4 Keys to Sustainable Living. He's going to talk to us today about civil discourse, and he has titled his speech, Toxic Talk, Is There an Antidote? We look forward to his presentation and have made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Foundation as a way of saying thanks to speaking to us today. As I welcome him to the podium, I will remind you that if time permits for questions, I will be out in the audience with the microphone, so please wait as the program is being recorded. Welcome.
Well, it is very good to be back with you. The last time I presented to the Rotary was shortly after the publication of the book that was just referenced, Making the Good Life Last. That's been about 8 years now, I believe. Thanks to the program committee, and particularly to Paul Fanlund and to Michael May for issuing this invitation to address you today. And it does indeed seem strangely appropriate to be addressing the Madison Rotarians so shortly after the death of my predecessor, who beat me out in terms of serving the society for 35 years as opposed to my mere 30. So anyway, I, of course, am a preacher, but I'm going to try to make this sound like something different from a sermon. So one typically thinks of science as one arena where differences of perspective are handled in a cool, dispassionate fashion. Researchers, as we know, gather empirical evidence. They test their hypotheses using commonly accepted methodologies. They make corrections as fresh information or more plausible explanations emerge. Science operates on the basis of provisional truths, and thus it requires its practitioners always to maintain an open mind. So one would suppose then that there would be little tolerance in science for the sort of stubborn rectitude and partisan sniping that have become such a commonplace in our politics and increasingly in our culture at large. Alas, it turns out that even highly regarded members of this epistemologically astute community sometimes do succumb to this all too human failing. Take, for instance, the ongoing debate over what killed off the dinosaurs. Why did the dinosaurs disappear? Was it the sudden impact of a 6-mile-wide asteroid in the Yucatan? Or was it a centuries-long series of climate-altering volcanic eruptions in central India? Or was it a combination of both? That first theory, the sudden impact theory, has held sway for several decades now, and its leading proponent, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Luis Alvarez, has defended that theory stridently and, at times, pugnaciously. Alvarez, as Bianca Bonker has written in the September issue of The Atlantic magazine, Alvarez has disparaged dissenting colleagues as, quote, not very good scientists, people who publish, as he put it, scientific nonsense. Confronted with suggestive and potentially disconfirming evidence from the fossil record, Alvarez offered this condescending rejoinder. Paleontologists, he sniffed, are more like stamp collectors than real scientists. A denigration of this sort, indulged in by a person of significant scientific stature, has led to an untoward effect. Some dissenters have quit the field entirely, afraid of being embarrassed or of jeopardizing their own careers. And thus, Bianca Bonker writes, the sudden impact theory has solidified, and alternative theories have been largely abandoned. But not abandoned entirely, for tough-minded researchers like Princeton's Greta Keller have refused to fold in the face of these complaints. The more people like Alvarez attack me, she told Bosker, the more I want to find out what's the real story behind it. Now, to be sure, such skirmishes in the world of science are relatively mild and rare compared to what we have been witnessing in the larger culture. These days, differences of opinion and of perspective quickly degrade into ad hominem attacks and online invective. And as a result, we are threatened with the loss, I believe, of any sense of shared vision or common purpose as a people. One would think that as American citizens, our needs and our interests would still converge at certain points, but identifying those points has become more and more difficult. Trust between and among Americans has been suffering serious erosion, compromising our ability to communicate with each other or to coordinate our efforts except in states of dire emergency. Now, a great deal has been written of late on this very subject, much of it, like Kathy Kramer's book, The Politics of Resentment, focused on the outlook of our country's rural and small-town residents. It's gotten downright nasty out there, Kramer observes about outstate Wisconsin. People in casual conversation are treating each other like enemies. This is a place, she says, where people are notoriously nice, seriously nice. But times change. Indeed, they do. Kramer contends that Wisconsin's political movers and shakers have played a leading role in fostering and in fomenting this fraught atmosphere. The seeds were sown over long periods of time, Kramer writes, and the political elites reaped the benefits of the divisiveness that they helped to create. Now, the Donald Trump phenomenon is simply the Wisconsin experience writ large and shorn of all pretense. Mr. Trump revels in the incivility and the trash talk that have long been his stock and trade. At a rowdy rally during the 2016 campaign, the candidate encouraged the crowd to root out and to expel any dissenters in their midst, which they gladly did to chants of USA, USA. Isn't this more fun than a regular boring rally? Trump shouted above the din. To me, he said, this is fun. So Mr. Trump anticipated, and he has found, a receptive audience for his demagoguery, or as his supporters admiringly put it, his tell-it-like-it-is bravado. And the culture has been shifting. The culture has been coarsening, and we may not have seen the worst of it yet. Liliana Mason is a professor of government and politics at the University of Maryland. She has been watching the trend line for a number of years, and she does not like the direction in which it's headed. I am worried, she says, about violent conflict across party lines, and I have not seen anything yet that might stop that outcome. And so other students of history warn that the country is today more polarized than at any time since before the Civil War. Now, internecine conflict has always figured in America's relationships with each other, not only politically, but religiously and culturally. But it did not always translate into the kind of rhetorical excess that we are seeing today. Consider, for instance, the run-up to the 2000 presidential election. Commenting on the Republican primary debate that was held that summer, Harper's Magazine's former editor, Lewis Lapham, groused that there was nary a sharp comment or challenging question uttered the entire evening. All 6 contestants, he complained, clearly wanted to be seen as nice guys. And they were all careful not to insult one another, not to give way to wild or angry words. This was the year 2000. And yet, for all of that, it is well to remember that while what's happening today may seem unprecedented, at least in our own experience, by historical standard, it's really not. Both before and during his presidency, Abraham Lincoln endured a steady stream of abuse from the press, from the pulpit, and even from his fellow Republicans. One prominent New York City attorney, a Republican, likened Lincoln to a barbarian, a yahoo, and a guerrilla. The celebrated preacher Henry Ward Beecher offered this rebuke: an unshapely man, lacking in refinement. And for the well-born George McClellan, commanding general of the Union Army, his superior was a coward and an idiot. During the McCarthy era, red baiting threatened the livelihood of teachers, novelists, screenwriters, scientists, labor leaders, civil servants, as well as political office holders. And those so charged with being pinkos were guilty until proven innocent, and often a mere accusation sufficed to heap disrepute upon its targets. Now, one might imagine that religious leaders would show greater restraint, that they might serve as models of brotherly and sisterly affection. And unfortunately, that's not always been the case either. Read the records of the early church, and you will find priests and bishops fulminating against their theological rivals. Martin Luther, instigator of the Protestant Reformation, was quick to pin the label Antichrist, meaning a human agent of the devil, on his opponents, whether secular or sacred. You know, and even the Gospels are less helpful in this regard than we might hope. To be sure, when we read the Gospels, Jesus counsels his followers to love their enemies, if offended, to turn the other cheek. And he also inveighed against hateful speech, declaring that anyone who says, "You fool," is inviting hellfire. And yet, the Gospels are not altogether consistent on such matters, because elsewhere in those same records, Jesus berates his own opponents as blind fools and vipers and hypocrites. Don't bother casting your pearls before such swine, he admonishes his disciples. So it seems then that incivility has achieved a long and lamentable track record. So here's the perennial challenge that we are all asked to face. Can we create today a climate of healthy partisanship, a partisanship that is free from the felt need to demonize our opponents? It's not an insignificant issue because words really do matter. 90 years ago, the great American educator and philosopher John Dewey warned that a democracy that has lost the art of public communication is a democracy on its way to chaos. So before entertaining a few possible remedies, it might be well to find out what perhaps might be the etiology of this illness. What forces have been at work in the larger culture, sowing discord and normalizing this incendiary discourse? With a firmer grasp of their source, we might then consider how some of these influences might be mitigated. Well, there seems to have been, in the first place, a general loosening of standards in the mother tongue, as it were. Some of us in this room, quite a few of us, I would imagine, are old enough to remember George Carlin's seminal comedic sketch entitled 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television. Carlin introduced that sketch in 1972, when the television code still imposed strict limits on what could be said or what could be displayed on the airways. And so profanity, sexual innuendo, irreverence, graphic violence, negative depictions of family life all transgressed the bounds of common decency according to the television code, and thus they were all suppressed. Now, needless to say, once the code was abolished in 1983, things began to change. Producers proceeded cautiously at first, but over time, George Carlin's 7 forbidden words crept into the mainstream. They staked their claim in our popular music, in film, in sports, and increasingly in our own casual conversations. And so the long and short of it is that many of us today are far less careful about the language that we use, the way that we express ourselves, and especially in the relative safety of online communication than we were in the past. And even here in the upper Midwest, where politeness has long stood as this cardinal virtue, we are less vigilant than we once were, or at least that our parents were. And it may also be true that today we are more easily provoked than we were in the past, and thus more given to incivility. And some of this, and particularly as has to do with political issues, has to do with the transformation of our politics into what we call a zero-sum game. Either you win or you lose. Either you are for me or you are against me. Now, an epithet that Donald Trump frequently employs to dismiss his critics is loser. You're a loser. And he has a habit of describing his own achievements, such as they are, as big wins or even humongous wins. Now, the substance of these wins doesn't seem to appear to mean that much to the president, as long as he wins, as long as he comes out on top. But as a larger-than-life figure, Mr. Trump only reflects and reinforces a rather commonly held sentiment. We live in a society where it's all about the will to power, the will to dominate, the will to conquer, as Cornel West recently put it in an interview. And as a result, he says, we are no longer having dialogues. It's all monologue. And this outlook isn't confined to our politics. As Red Sanders, the former head football coach at UCLA, famously declared, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing, a line often repeated and misattributed to Vince Lombardi. Winning matters a great deal, not only in the field of sports, but to a scientist like Luis Alvarez or to an ultra-rich predatory capitalist like Chicago's Paul Singer. As an outlook, it also adds fuel to the fires of resentment. Many of the rural and small-town folk that Kathy Kramer interviewed for her book, they said to her that they felt their communities were losing. Their towns were losing in the struggle for attention and power and resources. And urban dwellers, they insisted, were prospering at their expense. They were the winners. We're the losers, even though the data didn't necessarily confirm those claims. But as Kramer says, perceptions, not facts. That's what matters. And politicians, of course, exploit these sentiments. And the media, sorry, Paul, has also been somewhat complicit. Too much poll-driven political coverage that focuses on who's winning and who's losing at any given moment. And that only raises the emotional stakes as voters overinvest in the candidates of their choice. And so Liliana Mason, that political scientist from Maryland, says we need to tone down all of this winning versus losing. We need to focus more on what government is supposed to do for all of us rather than who's going to prevail in the latest conflict du jour. And zero-sum politics can also be highly subversive as those who lose, who are threatened with loss, begin to question the legitimacy of the outcome and the fairness of the system itself. It's rigged, they say. And then beyond that, the increasing tendency of Americans to self-sort into groups whose moral narratives mirror their own, that only serves to harden people's perspectives. And whether they take the form of online communities or coffee clatches at the local Denny's, such entities as these reinforce their members' sense of righteousness and dispel whatever doubts they might be entertaining. Our politics, Jonathan Haidt says, is groupish. And when we strongly identify with any particular group, its enemies become my enemies. This groupishness exacerbates the zero-sum game. For the stronger the connection to the group, the closer the identification, the harder it becomes to recognize outsiders as anything other than enemies who are governed by evil intent. As political scientist Jeremy Suri notes in his book, The Impossible Presidency, today's rabid partisanship defines compromise as appeasement of evil, and thus it prohibits any form of collaboration. So what's to be done? If we find the current state of affairs untenable and potentially dangerous, are there strategies we can adopt to improve our political and our cultural climate? One obvious strategy, as many people have pointed out, is to try, if we can, to step out of our own comfort zone. And that does not mean turning the channel to Fox and Friends. What I'm thinking of here is physical presence, inviting face-to-face interaction with people who do not necessarily share your moral narrative. And so, for instance, a couple of years ago, I started attending a Black Baptist church on the East Side on the Sundays when I did not have responsibilities in my own pulpit. And why did I do that? Because it had become clear to me in some of my conversations that I had not had enough direct exposure to Madison's African-American community to appreciate their concerns or know where they were coming from. And so I went there on multiple occasions, the same community each time, just to sit quietly and to feel the discomfort of being both white and non-Christian in a place where others defined the faith and others made the rules. As Kathy Kramer discovered after repeated visits to some of the North Woods communities that she studied, such encounters as these help establish a firmer basis for trust, and they can also soften the hard shell of our assumptions. And this, in turn, can lead to what the sociologist Peter Berger calls cognitive contamination, a greater receptivity to foreign points of view. And when that occurs, when that contamination takes hold, Berger suggests, it becomes increasingly difficult to characterize the beliefs of others as perverse or insane or evil. So in closing, here are a couple of other suggestions that might improve the quality of our conversations, especially those conversations that we are drawn into with people of competing viewpoints and sensibilities. First, think like a good scientist, which means holding on to your convictions lightly. Learn to be comfortable with provisional or tentative rather than final truths. Understand that there is as much value in not knowing as there is in knowing. As the Harvard entomologist E.O. Wilson advises, don't be afraid to use words and phrases that denote timid uncertainty. Words like apparently, seemingly, raises the possibility of, or it could well be. That is not sloppiness, Wilson assures us. It's just good professional conduct and true to the core of our scientific methods. And so we could all profit, I believe, from a little more intellectual humility as we try to engage each other in what could be challenging conversations. Second, and related to the foregoing, be more curious. And so make a point to ask questions rather than to share your opinions or your convictions. And then, having asked the question, listen more carefully to what you have just heard. As the 20th century playwright Eugene Ionesco once said, it's not the answer that enlightens, it's the question. I have found that people are more receptive when they are asked rather than told. Not interrogated, mind you. Not interrogated, but queried in such a way that suggests that you really care what that person is thinking. And you want to understand why they think that way. Be curious. Third, be patient, or as the Dalai Lama puts it, forbearing. The Tibetan word for this is sopa, and it denotes the ability to sit with discomfort and uncertainty until you have achieved a greater degree of clarity. It takes time, as we all know, to establish a rapport, much less a meeting of minds. And thus, we need to be committed to a relationship and not just to a conversation. It's not about winning, it's about cultivating mutual respect. Fourth, become more self-aware. As an interviewer, Kathy Kramer always tried to keep track of her body language. Folded arms, that suggests defensiveness and withdrawal. And along with many other mannerisms, it can betray a certain bias that the person is holding, and that's to be avoided. Tone is also important. Is your tone inviting? Is it friendly? Or is it aggressive? And is it challenging? The words themselves will probably never even register if there is even a hint of disapproval in one's tone. In his teachings, the Buddha acknowledged or admonished his followers to practice what he called right or skillful speech, and to practice it as a spiritual discipline. And such speech, the Buddha taught, is truly noble, is untainted, is elevated, is guided by compassion. Right speech is a crucial element, he says, on the road that leads to eternal bliss. As a society, we've become rather lazy and unguarded in our speech. So following the Buddha's advice will take some doing. Accordingly, my last point is this. We all need to practice. We need to strive at becoming more mindful in our everyday discourse, with colleagues, with customers, with family members, with members, first of all, of our own tribe. Chances are we've all been affected to some degree by today's toxic talk. And so we are definitely overdue for a refresher course in civility. This work is very, very hard, Liliana Mason says, but it's just the sort of work that might save a civilization. I won't say amen.
Thank you, Michael. We have about 5 minutes for questions.
Up here, I think that this lady had a question. There you go.
Thank you, Pastor. In these times, it seems that people tend to choose conversations with people with whom they are comfortable or people who they know aren't going to argue with them. Mm-hmm. And so your admonition is to go out and talk to people with whom you don't agree or people you don't know. What recommendations do you have in terms of how to do that?
Well, you know, I don't think that my point would be that the object is to go out and, you know, just surprise someone with a question about their politics, okay? Right, exactly. But I mean, I think the main thing is that, you know, I want to begin, you know, creating a kind of a banter between myself and other people who I'm pretty sure, you know, are not necessarily on the same page that I am, whether sociologically or whether politically, and kind of opening the door. So for instance, we have some folks who over the years have been delivering firewood to our house, live up in one of the smaller communities, you know, in north of Madison, and also done some other work for us around the house. Now, I could not tell you, standing here, whether in fact these folks voted for Donald Trump or not, or whether that they are rock-ribbed Republicans as opposed to my more Democratic leanings. But every time that they come, I try to establish a relationship. It's not just a fee for service. I am really trying to create a rapport between the two of us. And hopefully, at some point in time, that may allow for an opening up of a sharing of some of our perspectives. But the first thing is to think first about the relationship. And as I say, it's a long-term, you know, kind of enterprise that we're talking about here. And so I want to build some trust there. I mean, these folks come up and they see that I've got a Prius in my garage and, you know, and all the signs of being a Madison liberal, a Madtown liberal, and all the rest. So you know, I don't want to make any assumptions about them, but I also don't want them to make assumptions about me. And so this is the kind of strategy that I hope to use going forward, no matter where I happen to be, whether at home or whether I'm traveling out in the hinterlands. And you know, and I grew up as a farm boy, you know, so this is a culture I grew up in outside of Ronald Reagan's hometown, Dixon, Illinois. So this is a culture I'm also somewhat familiar with.
What can the media do to promote civility?
What kind of media?
What can the media?
What can the media do? Well, you know, I was kind of jumping on Paul a little bit here, but I mean, you know, I think that Paul and with the program that they're putting on this weekend are trying very, very hard to create a context for those kinds of conversations and inviting people across the political spectrum to have interchange with each other. I think that Paul and the Cap Times do a lot of really good in-depth reporting that gives us the substance of issues, and it isn't as poll-driven, I think, as some of the other media that we're exposed to. You know, a lot of people are saying, you know, people need to get off of the social media and begin reading newspapers again, and begin reading substantive newspapers again, begin reading books. I just finished an absolutely marvelous book that is written for a layman by two Harvard-educated political scientists, well, Harvard faculty. How Democracy Dies. How many people have read that? I recommend that book to everyone. It is an extraordinarily cogent book that talks about all the different forces in this particular society of ours, as well as societies around the world, that have been destroying what he calls the guardrails of our democracies. And he compares our own situation today with situations in Eastern Europe, in Central and South America. And it's a scary book, but it's also one that gives us, I think, a lot of hope about how we can reverse some of those trends. So How Democracy Dies, I would recommend that as an answer to your question.
Yeah.
Last question back there.
I had a question regarding assumptions, right or left.
Yeah.
One of the assumptions is the American dream, that everybody in this country has the opportunity to be able to be successful. Mm-hmm. Now, is this being compromised, just like globalization and other assumptions that we make as Americans? To me, it's so basic that the American dream has been part of our country ever since the Revolutionary War, that we have had a meritocracy where people with ability are able to succeed. And I think the right and left, I assume, both agree to that. Are we somehow, that assumption being broken down?
Well, if in fact it is being broken down, it certainly is one of the reasons why there is so much resentment in our country. If people no longer believe that, in fact, that that's the case, that everybody gets a fair shake, that it's a level playing field. I think, and actually, quite frankly, I think that that is the case. I think that that American dream that brought streams of immigrants from all over the world into this country has been significantly compromised. I'm not exactly sure how to respond to that other than to say that I think it has become a pretext, at least in some quarters, for scapegoating other people and for saying that you're not getting ahead even though you've got everything that you need to be able to prosper in this country because someone else is jumping in line ahead of you. And so instead of people kind of trying to recognize what are the underlying factors that are preventing people from using their skills and using their abilities in order to get ahead, why are people turning on each other and blaming one particular segment of the population for making another person's success impossible? So it gets back to that whole issue of resentment, and how do we get past that so we can find out what the underlying reasons are for why the American dream is failing. Okay, well, thank you very much again.